The lightweight division has been the showtime weight class in the sport for years now, and for this video, we're counting down the top 10 155-pounders to ever do it. Number 10, Rafael dos Anjos. And what better place to begin than with one of the most impressive champions of his era, a fighter whose longevity in the sport and success across two divisions is no accident. When Rafael dos Anjos eventually found the level of form he needed to rise out of obscurity, it was like watching a new technology before our very eyes. His ability to outwork and pressure Anthony Pettis to win the belt is among the greatest title-winning performances you will ever see, not to mention his KO of another former champ, Benson Henderson, and his total destruction of Nate Diaz and Donald Cerrone. RDA is still ranked in the top 15 at 155 too, even though he's approaching his 40th birthday. He might have a few losses here and there, but as a defending champion who has extended his career far past its sell-by date, he's a fitting opener for our top 10. Number 9, Eddie Alvarez. Eddie Alvarez is the very definition of a truly great underdog fighter. He won titles in every single organization he ever fought in, and even when it seemed like he was finally running out of momentum, the Underground King would find a way to rebound and prove his worth. He was the first man to beat Justin Gaethje. He beat Rafael dos Anjos, Shinya Aoki, Anthony Pettis, Michael Chandler, and Gilbert Melendez, to name but a few. And for the most part, he never failed to deliver an exciting performance. Trust us, if you haven't watched his series with Michael Chandler, you're missing out. Number 8, Benson Henderson. Benson Henderson might just be the most underrated fighter on this list. A highly technical, innovative, and creative fighter who managed to win and defend promotional gold in both the WEC and the UFC. In fact, he managed to retain his title 3 times in the UFC, beating some of the greatest fighters of his era: Frankie Edgar, Gilbert Melendez, Donald Cerrone, Nate Diaz, Jorge Masvidal, and more. He even went on to have a solid post-UFC career in Bellator, never straying too far out of the title picture, even as he approached 40 years old. Remember, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. Number 7, Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier is one of the finest fighters of his era, a guy who proves just how well things can go for an athlete who has the courage to admit to themselves that they're competing in the wrong division. The version of Dustin who found his feet as a 155-pounder was a different beast to the guy who got smoked by Conor McGregor at UFC 178. His chin, his power, his overall presence in the cage, all of these things were magnified by his pursuit of lightweight gold. And while he didn't manage to beat the two greatest champions the division has ever produced, the Diamond has had a truly phenomenal run, holding wins over Conor McGregor, Eddie Alvarez, Justin Gaethje, Benoit Saint-Denis, Max Holloway, Anthony Pettis, and more. An amazing run in the top flight. Number 6, Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson is a classic example of a guy who would be far higher on lists like this one if he hadn't dragged out his decline so much. El Cucuy, during that 12-fight winning streak, singled himself out as perhaps the most exciting fighter of his era, a true force of nature in the cage who was only denied a well-deserved title shot because of freak injuries, bad luck, and the existence of Conor McGregor. But after that grueling fight with Justin Gaethje, Tony sunk into a decline that was among the worst we've ever seen. Gone was that spark that made Ferguson who he was. Though you could still see that uncoachable toughness in moments, his body was no longer capable of performing the way it used to. In his prime, Ferguson beat the brakes off of some of the finest fighters of his era, but we get the feeling that he's liable to slide even further down this top 10 before all is said and done. Number 5, Justin Gaethje. Justin Gaethje is probably the most exciting fighter in MMA history, and that's not even a particularly controversial claim to make. But the thing about Gaethje that separates him from other action fighters is the fact that he has somehow molded his impressively entertaining style into a winning formula, dragging some of the finest lightweights of this era into wars and beating them. Sure, his grappling sucks, and his record in title fights shows a clear path to victory against him. But outside of those fights, Gaethje has a knack for dragging hardened veterans into deep water and drowning them. And perhaps most impressively, he does all of this and still manages to thrill the fans each and every time. An absolute bonus machine who is never in anything less than an amazing fight. Number 4, Islam Makhachev. Out of everyone we'll feature on this top 10, no fighter has the potential to rise higher before their career is finished than the great Islam Makhachev. His status as a dominant champion at 155 pounds right now is so clear-cut that it's hard to know exactly what his contenders will have to do to convince anyone that they have a chance at beating him. Beating Alexander Volkanovski and Charles Oliveira are the two names on his resume that far outweigh the others. But it's the manner in which Islam is defeating all of his opponents that gets him at the top 5 spot so early in this title reign. The best is clearly yet to come from this champion, and with a game as well-rounded as his, he could well have a potential within this sport that outreaches his friend and mentor Khabib Nurmagomedov. That is how good Islam Makhachev is. Number 3. BJ Penn. The story of BJ Penn's time in MMA has to be considered as a whole to really be fairly judged. But here's the thing, if you judge him based on his highest highs, the prodigy was as good as virtually anyone on this list. But while this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu phenom came into MMA, found an incredible boxing game to complement his grappling, and showed us some insane skills as champion, he also fell into possibly the worst decline in UFC history. Penn was so bad towards the end of his career that most newer fans know him more as a memeable punchline than as the era-defining great that he was. But Penn in his prime was truly excellent, a well-rounded threat who also had the physical tools to put his skills to use. Immense power, incredible speed, natural flexibility. BJ was, in essence, the perfect fighter for a short while, but we can't put him any higher than number 3 due to his inconsistency. Number 2. Charles Oliveira. If you're looking for a candidate for the most thrilling fighting career of all time, look no further than the run of the great Charles Oliveira. Once dismissed as a wild but dangerous prospect who would always run into trouble in the top flight, Charles reinvented himself once he left the featherweight division behind him for good, filling out his frame physically and refining his game into something truly outstanding. The run that brought Du Bronx from unheralded contender to defending champion is some of the most amazing MMA you will ever see, with each finish he scored being more thrilling than the last. And though his tale is not yet complete, his legacy as an all-time great of this division is most certainly set in stone. Oliveira might just be the most universally loved fighter in the sport, period. No one does it better than Charles Du Bronx, folks. Number 1. Khabib Nurmagomedov. And finally, we come to the number 1 spot, and it wasn't a particularly hard pick. Sure, other fighters had more high-level appearances and may have stuck around in the game for longer, but what Khabib Nurmagomedov brings to the table that no one can touch is total dominance. Khabib fought 29 times and only lost a handful of rounds, and in the 6 or 7 high-level matchups he eventually did find himself in, he displayed some of the highest levels of MMA we have ever seen, setting a new standard for wrestling and grappling dominance, changing the game in the process. When Khabib retired, it felt like we'd been cheated out of learning more about him, but all in all, you can't argue with what he managed to do in the top flight. An amazing fighter and an easy top 7 or 8 mixed martial artist of all time.